Hello and welcome to Moving Forward, a podcast by Good Habits. I'm your host, Amy Clark. In this podcast, we'll make sure you get the insights you need to build a high-performing learning culture in your organization. Whether you're an HR professional, a learning and development coach, or anyone looking to give their teams a leg up, you'll learn the tips and tricks you need to get your people learning and moving forward. In every episode, we like to get experts to join us, and we present them with a couple of key statements to try and get them really thinking and giving us their best insights. Today, the topic is diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Now, this shouldn't be a new topic for most people, but hopefully we can put a unique spin on it today when we think of it in the context of learning and development. So today I have our expert to join us, who's going to help us unpack this topic a little bit more. Welcome, Hanan Shaluki.
Thank you.
Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what makes you the right person to help us unpack this topic?
Well, I've been working on DEI for about 9 years now. I'm an inclusive communication expert, which means that I help organizations and companies, mostly in Belgium and Netherlands, but also abroad, really to help their processes become more inclusive. That goes from training to strategic work to campaign work. So I do a lot of different things, but they all center around DEI.
That's amazing. And I'm curious a bit more about this topic of inclusive communication. What does that mean exactly?
Well, the people that want to work with me usually come to me with two questions. It's either we want to reach a more diverse audience, but we have no idea how to do it, and we think that our communication might not be so inclusive. And the other question is, well, we do have a diverse workforce, but we have no idea how to communicate with them in a way that they all feel respected and heard, for example.
That's amazing. So it sounds like a lot of your clients really come from people who are quite aware of DEI already, and they're looking to improve on that.
Yeah, and that has really changed, like 9 years ago, I still had to convince many people of the importance of the topic, and today that's not the case. Today they are very much aware of the fact that they have to work and learn about this, and they usually come to me to understand, like, how do we get started and what should we do?
That's really, really encouraging, and I think that brings us perfectly to the first statement that I want to pose to you, which is DEI too often remains a tick box exercise. So can you tell me more what you think about that?
Well, firstly, I have to agree with that. I think that many people think it's very easy, tick the box. Okay, diversity, we have this many people of color, we have this many women in management, tick, 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 we're doing great. And I think that it's a very superficial way to understand these concepts. Diversity really is about observing differences between people, and sometimes these differences are very clear, but very often they are not that clear. When we talk, for example, about gender, I know that women in management is a very important KPI for companies. But when we talk about women, we usually talk about white women or women who've already had 25 years of experience in the company, which you can already wonder, why are they not yet in management? And we rarely talk about women of color, for example, or other women. So I really try to look at it from an intersectional point of view, that we all have an identity that is based off so many different elements. How do we deal with those differences? And that's how we get to inclusion. So where diversity is just like observing the differences, inclusion is how do we work with those differences? How do we make sure that everyone feels respected and included and engaged and heard at work, for example? So there is a huge difference between the two. And when we talk about equity, it's about realizing that not everybody starts at the same level. So when we think about certain minority groups, for example, within a company, how do we make sure that they get equal opportunities by actually supporting them even more or giving them the necessary tools to grow and to learn more about this topic? So that's really what the difference is between those three.
Okay, so that's diversity,
equity,
and inclusion. And I really like the inclusion side of it because, like you say, it's all good to say, we've got this many people in this position, but what are you really doing about including those people? And I mean, certainly as an expat myself, I can attest to it's no longer just it's race, it's gender. It's so much deeper than that.
Yeah, Absolutely. And it's so easy to work on diversity. Like, it's very easy to bring a lot of different people into the same room and say, hey, look at this. We have a very diverse room of people. But let's say you're having a meeting with those people. Who is speaking up? Who is not afraid to share their ideas or share their expertise? Who feels smaller in a meeting and who feels really big? So these are the things that you work on when we talk about inclusion. Inclusion it's sometimes very hard to measure, but it is really about how people feel within a company, which is a lot more important than just simply bringing them together. And, I'm sure they'll find a way to work together. That's not really how it works.
Yeah, it's a lot deeper than that. And I wonder, you work with a range of clients. Do you notice quite a big difference between industries? Obviously, you have, like I said, people coming more to you who already thought about it. But are you seeing a difference or a shift between different sectors?
Yeah, I think all industries are different because all industries also have different levels of diversity. For example, I work with very scientific or tech industries, which are a little more male oriented, and they usually work on gender, for example. But you also have like government offices or departments where they see that their employees are getting older and older, and it's very difficult to attract and retain young talent. So they have a different challenge there. And I think when it comes to inclusion, you always have certain industries that are more open to growing into a more inclusive industry or a more inclusive company than others. So there's always that level of comfort that people have, and especially in certain industries.
Can you give me an example of one of the industries that's more open?
Yeah, I think that, for example, when I think of the creative industry, I see a lot of goodwill, a lot of good intentions, and they really want to work on DEI, but it's still very difficult to change certain processes. Or when we talk about neurodiversity, for example, the creative industry is a very extrovert industry. You have a lot of people brainstorming, and everybody has to pop up with all these ideas, and there's a pizza on Friday, and let's have drinks, and so, yeah, it's a very extrovert industry where when you come in as a person who's a little more introvert, you might find it very difficult to integrate in that kind of industry. But it is a sector that really works on DEI, that wants to make a difference, but they have their own challenges.
Yeah, I mean, with good intentions, sometimes it doesn't always follow through into the actions, of course. Now, amongst all these industries, I mean, there's one thing that you need to get right, and that is the whole environment in which a DEI can thrive. So let's talk more about the process that it involves. I mean, we talked about company culture and the creative chaos. How can you get DEI really into the process?
Well, there are, of course, a lot of steps that you need to take. And I think that learning about the topic is a very important one. I think that, as you said before, like, it can be a very easy tick the box kind of thing, but it really takes a lot of time to create a support base for the topics, and that means learning about them. Especially, for example, in HR, I think that HR departments are they have their processes, and they know how to recruit certain people and how to write their vacancies, for example. And learning about diversity and inclusion really helps you to integrate these topics and to make sure that everything you do, everything you create becomes more inclusive. And it is definitely a process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And you need everyone to learn about the topic. That means not just the HR departments or the hiring managers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great place to move on to our next statement, which says, DEI should have the same priority for learning and development as it does for HR. And I think I can guess what...
Yeah, and I can only agree with that. And I think that we very often assume that DEI is easy. It's just about being amongst different people and, just be respectful and get along with everyone. But it is so difficult, and it's not just about cultural diversity. It's about so many different types of people, and you can't assume that anyone knows how to deal or how to have a conversation or how to behave in an inclusive way simply because they are human and they are respectful, because we can all make mistakes and we can all say the wrong things. So it's good to have some sort of guidelines or tools and to really learn about, okay, so how do we deal with these differences, and how do we approach certain things in a more inclusive manner? This is not a skill that you're born with, and I sometimes say it's really a language that you need to learn how to speak, and it's not a language that it comes easy. It really takes training and working on it. It's like a craft.
I love that you make the link to language, and I think it really hints towards your expertise as inclusive communication expert. I think we often just exist in our little bubbles, and not nobody, but I think few people are actively uninclusive.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of awareness.
Well, I think that indeed a lot of people have good intentions, but having good intentions doesn't mean that you don't have a negative impact. So I really try to make them aware of this fact, and that it's not something that they always do with a negative purpose in mind. And many people really like that idea because it means that, okay, so there is room for growth. So I can do something about it. So if I learn about this, and I will become a better and a more inclusive colleague. And indeed, I do a lot of training. I do a lot of these exercises with companies. And what I really like to trigger them and confront them with their own bias, which is always like shocker because
trigger has quite a strong connotation.
Like trigger them, but like not in a negative way, but
learning.
Like making them more aware of the many ways in which their bias can have an impact. When I asked them to think of, for example, I asked them to picture a certain person with a certain job, and their bias immediately goes to a very stereotypical description, which is not a harmful thing, but it can become harmful when you need to pick that next colleague for that project that you're working on, and you still have those biases. So I really like to make people aware of the fact that they don't always have to actively exclude people to make it happen. So this is really a mindset. And if they accept that mindset and they become really open to personal growth and learning, that's when you can create a difference.
Absolutely.
I think that very often people assume that I only want to train HR managers or CEOs of a company. And I think that when it comes to learning and development, everybody has a responsibility here, especially in DEY. We are all colleagues working together for the same company. Everybody can have an impact, a positive impact at work or a negative impact at work or no impact at all. And you want to make sure that when it comes to DEY, you can translate that into a positive impact. You cannot do that if you're only focused on HR processes or only on inclusive leadership. In many ways, I think that we can all be leaders at work, especially social leaders.
I completely agree.
Like if you go to the coffee machine and you have an encounter there with somebody that's really negative, then it doesn't matter if they are the CEO of the company or the receptionist or anyone really. That needs to happen in an inclusive way. So this way that we can all impact DEY at work is also why we all need to learn about DEY.
Yes, I also think in the process, like you mentioned, this coffee machine discussion, creating kind of micro ambassadors of DEI, maybe people who've really taken on more of that learning and development about the topic and can start being a bit proactive, then I think you start getting the little changes.
Yeah. And the thing is that many companies already have DEI as a value. For example, you can have so many different company values and diversity and inclusion can be one of them. But if it just remains with that, like if it's just a value that people don't really know anything about or don't really know how to deal with it, or then what is the translation of that value to real life? And I think that is also so important to make sure that you create a support base for diversity and inclusion. If you want people to change their behavior or change the way they communicate, then you need to tell them why that is essential and how they need to do that.
Absolutely. The why for me is a big one because getting on board with a change, people don't really understand the basis of it. And if you are, especially if you're living in a less marginalized body or you don't have these experiences, it could be hard to understand the why because you don't see the problem.
Yeah, of course. And I have a lot of conversations with people about privilege, and some people take it really badly when I say that you have privileges, and it becomes easier when I say I also have privileges. Like the fact that I was born in Belgium created a very different life for me than if I was born in Morocco or if I was born in a war zone today. So the fact that you have these privileges can make you a little bit oblivious to certain challenges that other people go through. So this is why it's so important to constantly reflect on who you are, but also like your behavior towards other people from more marginalized communities. And that's how you can create a difference.
On this line of privileges, I also think that learning in itself is a privilege. I mean, I come from a country where basic education is really, really poor. And so I'm extremely privileged. I think the same would go within a company, giving the privilege of learning opportunities to an equitable population. Do you see that companies are struggling to identify learning opportunities for minorities or like they go for the classic extroverts and they put them on a training course, or what do you see there?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the company. I think some companies rarely invest in learning and development in the first place, which is already...
Are you really seeing that?
I am seeing that, especially when it comes to, for example, people working in factories. Like their leaders can just assume, well, as long as they are standing there and packaging and doing their job, then everything is fine. They don't need to learn. But the fact is that person standing there and packaging a certain product is working with a lot of different people. And I'll tell you, they'll work together a lot better if they know how to communicate with each other in a more positive and in a more inclusive way. So learning opportunities are not like an automatic thing for many companies. And I think that there is a difference in industries.
It's a real shame for me because it feels that there's an opportunity here for employers to really use their learning and development department to level the playing field.
Yeah.
For a lot of people who are coming from diverse backgrounds that didn't get that leg up to start with.
Yeah, and that's why we talk about equity. Like, you wouldn't hire a person in a wheelchair, for example, and say, well, you can come and work for us, but we don't have a special office for you, or you can't really enter the building, but good luck, and I hope to see you on Monday. So yeah, you're not creating the decent environment for them to work in the best way that they can work. And the same goes for DUI.
When we're talking about working environments, I'm hearing a lot lately about neurodiversity and making space in the workplace for people with different brains. It feels kind of like a buzzword at the moment.
Yeah, and it's not new. Like, you've always had people that work better in a certain environment. Like, I'm sure that you have friends that are better at working when they are secluded from everyone else and they have a couple of focus hours every week. And the same goes that's basically what neurodiversity is about. And you see those same trends within companies. We're just more aware of the fact that we need it to become more creative, more innovative, more productive. And I see this, I see a lot of companies paying attention to that, and I think that's really a good thing. Well, whether we're having silent Tuesdays, where Tuesdays are not for meetings, for example, or we can create a small office space for people that want to work in silence for a couple of hours every day. Those are very good things. Not everyone works in we call it islands. Like, when you have these little offices all together, not everyone can be very productive in a situation like that. So it's also about creating the best work environment for your people.
Yes, and I see this at work as well. And what tends to happen when you don't make those kinds of spaces are the people who don't thrive in a traditional office setting go and work from home.
Yeah.
And that, I think, fosters even more exclusion because they're not, a lot of things happen on the floor that you can get involved with. You hear this, you hear that, and you get to collaborate. And those people then, people are like, oh, but they excluded themselves. They chose to work from home. But did you really create the environment for them to be their best selves in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I heard this a lot when COVID happened and everybody had to work from home. And of course, there are benefits to working from home, but there's also a lack of social relationship building that you can do. You can sit at home and attend every meeting, but after a while you zone out and you don't even know the people that you're in a meeting with because you almost never see them, and you don't have those informal moments like lunches or coffee breaks or just one-on-one conversations at that coffee machine. And I think that people underestimate the impact of that.
This whole topic of neurodiversity came to me through my own personal learning and development. And when you start to think in those terms, it really does help broaden your perspective of what you need to do. And this brings me to my next statement, which is DEI is a skill that can be taught to your employees. What do we think about that one?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And you can't assume that everyone knows how to react all the time in every environment towards every type of person. There are so many differences between us. And right now we are more aware of that than ever. And I usually compare it by saying it's like a language that you need to learn how to speak.
I love that. That's really makes a lot of sense because it's interpersonal communication.
Yeah, it's
essentially
interpersonal communication, and it has so many layers, and you can't expect everyone to be born with the gift of communicating with every type of person. That's just not something that you can do. So learning that language, learning to talk about DUI, but also learning to talk to different people in a certain way that they know they feel more included and they will appreciate it instead of using very excluding behavior or excluding language. This is definitely something that you have to learn.
Can you give us some examples of what those skills or inclusive language would be? Because I think it's, like you say, if you don't know what you don't know.
yeah, exactly. And there are so many examples from so many different types of minorities in our society that I could use. But I think that, for example, when it comes to cultural differences, when it comes to Ramadan, for example, is the yearly month where people like Muslims fast during this month. It's a spiritual month, but a lot of Muslims get confronted with microaggressions at work and very inappropriate comments because people just don't have an idea of what it means to be a Muslim and fasting, and how do you have a conversation about that topic. And I think that, as you said before, you can have good intentions, but that doesn't always mean you can have a positive impact. So, for example, a lot of people will go like, oh, so you must be really hungry and really thirsty. And and are you even focused? Like, can you even work while you're fasting? And people will say these things with the best intentions, but it will still make your Muslim colleague feel terrible at work.
You know, that's really a shame to hear, because that sounds like absolutely something that I would do, because I'm a very curious person. So I suppose my question is, how do you balance this curiosity with being respectful? Like, is the answer to go and research all these different cultures? I mean, obviously that's great, but I don't know if that's super realistic for most employees. Or are there some basic foundational communication skills that we could be using here?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think curiosity is a great quality. Like for anyone, it's one of the 6 qualities of inclusive leadership. It's a great quality when it comes to inclusive communication. And there are some basic things that you can learn. But what I usually advise people is when you work in a certain environment where you know there are people with certain backgrounds or certain identities or certain communities, do a little research. Like you don't have to research the entire world, every culture, every history, but do a little research about the people that you're working with. Like what do I not know about their culture that might actually enrich my cultural knowledge? So just doing that is can already move mountains, but there are some basic skills. Like for example, like don't assume anything. Like don't say things like, oh, you must be hungry, you must be thirsty. Keep your questions open and keep your questions respectful. Those are like some basic things that everyone can use during these conversations.
And what about this? Something I try and do is sort of say, I'm curious about it. Would you like to talk about it sometime? Or are you interested in teaching me? I think too often we make these assumptions and we're like, okay, everyone likes to talk as much as I do. They're going to be super stoked to share about their struggles. No,
that's not the
everyone's
case.
open
But
to
that's
that.
good. Like that's also what I have to repeat very often is like not everyone is comfortable sharing that much about their culture or religion or any identity really that they have or their childhood at work. So just asking the question like, do you mind sharing a little bit more about this, or do you mind if I ask this? That can already like make a big difference.
It, I think, requires quite a lot of thinking before you speak.
Yes.
And also, like you say, getting on board with the change and understanding the perspective of you know, everybody else and what they're going through. Can you tell me a little bit more about how we can deal with resistance to change when it comes to DEI initiatives, and where maybe learning can play a role in that?
I think resistance is a good thing. Well, I know that a lot of people don't understand when I say that, but I do think that resistance is a good thing because it means you are doing something new, or you are bringing something new to the people that you work with. And the fact that they resist a little is very natural. Like a lot of people don't deal that well with change. I think learning can come in very handy here, because what helps with the resistance is understanding why something is necessary. Why is it necessary to change certain things? Why is it necessary that we learn how to communicate in a more inclusive manner? And knowledge and insights is really what can deliver that message. If you want to create change, you need to create a support base for that change, and really getting people on board and providing the necessary knowledge or insights and tools can help reduce that resistance.
So we were talking about how to create this more inclusive culture and learning and development, but how does leadership play a role in this? You mentioned curiosity earlier as one of the traits of an inclusive leader. Can you tell me about some other leadership traits that could be valuable here?
Well, of course, communication is a crucial one because that's really what it's all about. Like, how do you, as a leader, communicate with people from different walks of life, people with different backgrounds? But the one I like most is courage. And I think that courage, well, first of all, the courage to make difficult decisions sometimes, the courage to deal with that resistance when it comes to DEI, but also the courage to say it when you don't know it. I
love that one. Tell me more about that one.
Well, I don't think we can expect every leader to know everything when it comes to DEI, like we wouldn't expect them to know everything about every other facet of life or work.
Human.
Yeah, we're only human. And I think that one of the most courageous things that an inclusive leader can do is say, well, I don't have an answer to that, but let me check it and research it, and I'll get back to you. And I think that courage to admit that you don't have all the answers, especially when it comes to DEI, but that you're willing to learn about it or get that expertise and involve more people, that's a really important trait of inclusive leadership.
I really love that. I think in general, leadership, just being able to admit when they don't know, is really powerful and vulnerable as well.
Yeah, and it has really changed. Like we used to look up to leaders who like knew everything, or at least we thought that they knew everything. But right now, vulnerability is a great skill and a great aspect of being a leader, like not being afraid to be vulnerable and saying like, I don't know it. It puts you in a more vulnerable position, but it will also get you more respect from the people that work with you.
And you become more relatable as well. I mean, when I
Exactly.
became a manager myself, I also had this idea like, oh, you need to be a certain way. But the more you can just be honest about your journey,
Yeah,
I think the better
exactly.
it's going to go for everybody. Quick last one on this topic. How do you keep DEI relevant as a learning and development department? Like, obviously, it's a continuous process. Would it be through sort of seminars? Would you be sending out emailers like read this or engage? Like, how would you do that in a way that's kind of organic?
Yeah, well, the thing is with DEI, it's a topic that is continually changing. And I think that, for example, when we talk about gender today, that's a very different conversation today than what we would have had 10 or 15 years ago.
No doubt.
Yeah, and there are so many different ways to keep learning, and I think training and seminars can be one of them. I think that keeping people up to date with little messages or little bits of content, for example, on a certain topic can already keep them engaged and make sure that they are continuously learning more about this topic. But it can be the big things. It can be a big event, a big training, anything. But it can also be in the small things, like having a dialogue and having conversations on these topics to make sure that people know that this is something that is continuously changing and it will keep changing forever. And there will always be new things to learn about, new aspects to discover, and just to make sure that people understand that.
You know, I think you're right. It totally evolves. I feel like people get a bit fatigued by the topic.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, stop shoving it down my throat.
Yeah.
But it's the reality of, I mean, everyone has these intersectional identities. So, I mean, maybe reflect on your own identities too and think, I mean, I thought I was pretty classic, not a minority, you know, but when you really think about it, everybody has these different ways that we are different. And
And I understand that people can get a fatigue because DEI is often brought in a very standard, repetitive way that, like, we've all seen it, we've all heard it. But that's why it's interesting to make sure that people get new ways of consuming information on the topic to make sure that it stays relevant for them.
Yeah. Awesome. I love that. I think we're going to move on to our last statement for the episode. And this is one that I think about quite often. I think it's an excuse. The impact of DEI initiatives aren't measurable for the bottom line. There's so many loaded things in this statement.
Yeah, there is.
Let's start with the measurable part of it.
Yeah, well, I don't agree that it's not measurable. I think that many things are measurable, but first of all, we should wonder, like, why do we need to measure the impact? So I think that inclusion especially is about people feeling good at work, feeling happy at work. And you can't put a price on that, or you don't really have to measure every inch of that.
Yeah, why does it have to be this whole thing?
Yeah,
It's just feeling good at work.
Yeah, and I think that when we look at studies, for example, that show that one of the things that show how long we will live, like that's literally an aspect of how long will you live, how old will you get to be, is the amount of qualitative social relationships that we build. And we spend so much time at work. Like, imagine if you don't feel good at work, if you don't feel included at work, that becomes a very negative cycle, something that you bring home with you every single day. And it's just a missed opportunity because you could build great relationships at work in an inclusive environment and it will literally prolong your life. So that is something that it's a human right. I think that inclusion is a human right for every person. But when you really want to measure it, I think there are so many ways to measure the impact of DEI, but it depends on what you want to measure. Like, for example, when it comes to diversity, I already said
It's easy to measure.
Yeah, it's easy to measure certain aspects. For some other invisible aspects, you can ask people about it or like use surveys and anything else. But when you look at the studies about the impact of DEI on our productivity, on our innovation, on the amount of ideas that we can have and that we can develop within the companies, there are so many studies that prove that a diverse and inclusive work environment leads to a better work environment, a more productive company. So if you just use those numbers, then you can already see what your impact is supposed to be. And there are certain things that you cannot measure. You don't have to measure everything. That's my
I think that's a
statement.
really good message.
Yeah.
Also, if you just look at it basic at the core, what inclusivity does is create an environment for better collaboration and communication. You take completely away the cultural and gender and whatever identities. That's what it is at the basic. And that's what all organizations are looking for.
Of course.
It really seems like a no-brainer. And it really, really bugs me when we're always trying to find the business case. Like, do we have to have a business case for being good human beings?
Well, that's the thing. I found out during the years that the business case is really what convinces many companies to get on board with DEI. And I think that there is always a business case, but it shouldn't always be the priority. Take care of your people, take care of the people that you work with, that work for you, and then you've already accomplished a great goal there.
I guess we should just be glad that there is a business case for it, so the people who do want to look for it have the answers that they need.
Exactly.
Can you think of some more tangible ways you could measure it? Let's talk about rather people's feelings. How are they feeling inclusive? How much can you go about really checking that out?
Yeah, well, I had a conversation with a company not too long ago, and they said 95% of our people say that we are an inclusive company, so we must be doing a great job. And then I asked them, like, how did you measure this? And they said, well, it's just a survey that you can fill in voluntarily, but from the people that filled it in, 95% felt like we are a very inclusive company. And I said, well, what if the people that didn't fill it in because they don't feel like you're an inclusive employer? Or what if all the people that filled in the survey are the people that belong to certain majorities and have certain privileges and don't even have to think about inclusion that much? And they were like, oh, we didn't actually consider that. So it's you could definitely ask the people, like, how well do you feel at work? How comfortable do you feel with sharing certain ideas? Do you feel like you're being respected at work? Do you feel like people are listening to you? Do you feel like they value your ideas? These are all good questions to ask, but make sure to either ask them to everyone or ask them to the people that are most likely to feel excluded within a company.
Yeah, maybe that 5% that also said no, that's an important 5%.
Yeah, exactly. So find out who those 5%
They're probably your
are.
minority. You should go and talk to them.
Probably, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I think you've really brought this conversation to a full scope for us all to think a lot about. Could you just give us one key takeaway for our learning and development listeners out there? What can they do in the next few weeks to really help with their DEI initiatives?
Well, I think never stop learning. I think to realize that DEI is always changing and there's always something new coming up that you need to know about. So just accept the fact that this is an ongoing journey and build the time to learn more about the topic.
Absolutely. For me, I think as my takeaway as well, links to that is it's an organization-wide initiative. It's not just about the people in HR. It's not just about the HR processes, but it's really about getting everybody on board and bringing them along for the change.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. I hope you learned something new in this episode. So please, if you did, share it with somebody else so they can learn too and move their people forward. And while you're at it, give us a review. It helps us reach the people that really need to learn more about this topic. Thank you so much. Cheers for now.